Berlin, 1923. The exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to $1. People were wheelbarrowing cash to buy bread. Savings that families had spent lifetimes building became worthless paper in months. And in the ruins of that economic collapse, something specific happened to the women of Germany. Widows in their 20s and 30s, middle-class women who had lost husbands to the war and savings to the inflation, found themselves with no income and no institutional support. What happened next was documented by Hans Ostwald in his 1931 Moral History of Inflation. Upper-class ladies working out of Berlin clubs, women who had been teachers and secretaries and housewives turning to prostitution, not as a choice in any meaningful sense, but as the only reliable path to survival in an economy that had destroyed every other option. The historian who studied this period described how the prostitute became an essential part of the scene in the 1920s. In Alfred Dublin's novels and Fritz Lang's films, she became the symbol of the city itself, the incarnation of a capitalism that had ended up in the moral gutter. The economic conditions created the supply, the infrastructure extracted value from that supply. The women at the bottom earned survival, the men who ran the infrastructure accumulated wealth, and the visible sexual commercialization of Weimar culture produced in time a specific political reaction. Conservative and religious groups mobilized around what they called moral dissolution. The unease was real, it was widespread, it had no legitimate political outlet, and the people best positioned to exploit it did exactly that. That was 100 years ago. Now look at 2026, young women who cannot afford rent, young women carrying student debt for degrees. The labour market has stopped valuing young women in a housing market where their income will not stretch to a deposit. Young women in the most economically precarious position the Western world has produced in a generation, and a platform with $6.6 billion in annual revenue offering them a way out. The conditions that created the supply in Weimar Berlin and the conditions that created the supply for OnlyFans in 2026 are not identical, but the structure underneath them is the same. Economic desperation meeting a platform that extracts value from young women's bodies and directs the proceeds elsewhere. 100 years apart. The same mechanism. And something else worth saying before we go any further, I am 24, and I have noticed something in the last year or two, checking the social media of people from my year at school, people I grew up with, and you see the odd girl with an OnlyFans link in their bio, not loads, but enough that it makes you pause, enough that it does not feel surprising anymore. And that specific thing, the fact that it does not feel surprising, is more telling than any statistic in this video. When did this become normal? How did it become normal? And what does normal actually mean here? That is what this video is about. Let's start with what OnlyFans actually is, because the way it presents itself and the way it actually functions are two completely different things. OnlyFans generated over $6.6 billion in revenue in 2023. The owner, a Ukrainian-American businessman named Leonid Radvinsky, took $472 million in personal dividends from the platform in 2023 alone, up from $338 million the year before, up from $284 million the year before that. He is the sole shareholder. He bought the majority stake in 2018 from the British founder Tim Stokely. Since he took over, the platform became increasingly focused on adult content and gained a pop culture reputation for being a hive of pornography. He was already in the industry before OnlyFans. He owned MyFreeCams. He knew exactly what he was building and who would build it for him. The platform presents itself as empowerment. Creator economy, take control of your content, build your own income, be your own boss. And on the surface, it looks like that. Sophie Rain, a 19-year-old waitress from Tampa, made $95 million in 3 years from a case of mistaken identity involving a Spider-Man video that was not even hers. Mia Khalifa went from making $12,000 in an industry that took everything from her to sitting front row at Milan Fashion Week. The success stories are real. The presentation is that this is what is available, that this is what the platform offers. Here is what is underneath the surface. For every Sophie Rain, there are approximately 10,000 women uploading content that nobody is paying for. OnlyFans has an estimated 3 million creators. The platform's revenue is concentrated at the extreme top end. The vast majority of creators make somewhere between nothing and minimum wage when their hours are calculated. They are subsidizing the traffic that makes the top earners possible. They are producing an unlimited library of material for a platform they do not own, receiving a wage that for most of them works out to be below what they would make in the serving job Sophie Rain left. The platform takes 20% of everything. It retains the data permanently. Every interaction, every subscriber, every payment is logged and owned by the company indefinitely. What OnlyFans actually is, structurally, mechanically, is Amazon for sex, or DoorDash for sex. Thousands of near-identical thumbnails of near-identical women doing near-identical poses, all fighting for the same fraction of available attention, all undercutting each other on price, all promising more than the last one. The girl who promises the most gets the subscriber, the girl who promised slightly less loses her. The market logic pushes in one direction and one direction only. Escalation, more, further. The arms race that produced a British creator having sex with over 1,000 men in 12 hours and posting a hospital photo afterwards describing the damage to her body. That is not an anomaly. That is the end point of a system whose incentives reward whoever will go furthest. The platform did not create that woman's choices, it created the conditions in which those choices made economic sense. And the man sitting at the top of that system, collecting $472 million a year in dividends, while millions of women produce the content that generates it, is Leonid Radvinsky, who denied donating to anything, whose name appeared on an AIPAC internal donor list obtained by the Lever, whose wife's wire transfer to the organisation was documented. The largest single known donation in AIPAC's post-October 7th fundraising haul, $11 million, appears to trace back to the owner of the platform, built on the labour of young women who keep most of what they make, while he takes a cut of everything forever. The man who built the most efficient content extraction machine in the history of the internet, using the bodies of young women as the product, used the proceeds to fund the organisation that spent $127 million shaping American congressional elections, the same organisation that spent $20 million removing the 2 members of Congress who called for a ceasefire. Connect those 2 facts and sit with them for a moment. The money flows from the bodies of young women through Radvinsky to AIPAC to the purchasing of American political outcomes. That chain is documented. Every link in it is traceable. This is not presented to you as a conspiracy. It is presented as the normal operation of concentrated capital in a system that has no mechanism for questioning where the money comes from or what it funds. The Weimar parallel goes deeper than the economic conditions, because the specific philosophical and intellectual climate that produced the 1920s sexual economy in Germany is worth examining, because it rhymes with something recognizable. The Weimar Republic was also the era of the Frankfurt School, of a specific intellectual project that sought to liberate human sexuality from the repressive structures of bourgeois morality. Herbert Marcuse developed the argument that the repressive desublimation of the consumer society, giving people sexual gratification while denying them genuine freedom, was a more sophisticated form of control than outright repression. Marcuse's argument is the one that applies most precisely to OnlyFans and the attention economy in 2026. Repressive desublimation. The appearance of sexual freedom as a mechanism of control. Young women are told they are empowered, they are told they are exercising agency. They are told that monetizing their sexuality is liberation from the old structures that exploited them. And what they are actually doing is producing content for a platform owned by a billionaire who takes 20% of everything and donates the proceeds to a political lobbying organization. The freedom is real at the individual level in the sense that no one is forced. The function of that freedom at the systemic level is the extraction of value from the bodies of young women by men who will never meet them. Marcuse saw this clearly in the 1950s and 60s when the consumer society was just beginning to develop the apparatus for it. He could not have imagined OnlyFans specifically, but he described its logic with precision 50 years before it existed. The Skinner box is the other framework worth understanding. B.F. Skinner demonstrated that variable ratio reinforcement, rewards delivered unpredictably, sometimes after one press of the lever, sometimes after 50, produces the most compulsive and resistant to extinction behavior in any organism tested. It is the mechanism behind slot machines. The next spin might pay out. The next image might be the one. The next category might provide the stimulus the previous one stopped providing because the brain has adapted to it and requires escalation. The pornography platform is a Skinner box. It was not designed to be one accidentally. The variable ratio reinforcement of the scroll, the algorithm, the recommendation engine, these are engineering choices made by people who understand the neuroscience and have deployed it deliberately in the service of maximizing time on platform. The average age of first exposure to pornography for boys in America is now 11 years old. 11, not a teenager encountering it by accident. An 11-year-old whose prefrontal cortex will not be fully developed until his mid-20s, whose dopamine system is in a period of heightened sensitivity, whose understanding of what sex is and what it means is being formed in real time, encountering an industrial product specifically engineered to maximize arousal and the compulsion to return. The brain that begins its sexual development inside a Skinner box does not develop the same relationship to genuine human intimacy as the brain that did not. The neuroscience on this is not fringe. It is published in mainstream psychiatric and neurological journals. The mesolimbic dopamine pathway, the brain's reward system, is highly activated during pornography consumption in ways that parallel the activation produced by addictive substances. The research on compulsive pornography documents alterations in brain connectivity between the reward system and the prefrontal cortex that are consistent with addiction patterns. The brain adapts to the level of stimulation it receives and requires escalation to produce the same dopamine response. This is why the market logic of the pornography platform and the neurological logic of the addicted brain are perfectly aligned. The platform benefits from escalation. The addicted brain requires escalation. They are not in conflict. They are cooperating. The specific consequence documented most clearly in the clinical research is psychogenic erectile dysfunction. Erectile dysfunction in the absence of any physical cause. The prevalence rate among European men aged 18 to 40 has risen sharply in the last decade to between 14 and 28%. Nearly 1 in 3 young men with a functional problem with sexual response in the presence of an actual partner. The research links this directly to pornography consumption via the dopamine pathway mechanism. The brain trained to respond to an escalating series of novel digital stimuli becomes less responsive to the comparatively static reality of an actual human being. The product was not designed with the well-being of its consumers in mind. It was designed to maximize consumption. The consumers are experiencing the consequences of that design in their own bodies and their own relationships, and almost nobody in mainstream discourse is willing to say so plainly. Now, the men who are not just consuming this but actively promoting it to young audiences, because this is the pipeline that takes what is happening at the industrial level and delivers it directly to teenagers. The streaming world has produced a specific category of male influencer whose business model involves proximity to OnlyFans creators. Large streaming audiences, predominantly young and male, with female content creators appearing regularly to promote their platforms to audiences that include underage viewers. The economics of this are straightforward. The streamer gets content and engagement. The creator gets promotion to a large new audience. The platform gets new subscribers. Nobody in this arrangement is thinking about the 14-year-old watching. Nobody in this arrangement has any financial incentive to think about him. The specific mechanism is more damaging than simple exposure to adult content. The streamers who platform OnlyFans creators are not just exposing young audiences to sexual content, they are normalizing the specific idea that this is what women are for, that the successful women are the ones who monetize their bodies, that this is aspirational. A teenage boy who watches hours of streaming content in an environment where the women who appear are predominantly there to promote their OnlyFans accounts is receiving a very specific education about what women are and what the relationship between men and women consists of. He is receiving it before he has any real experience of that relationship to compare it against. The Bezmenov framework is relevant here too. Yuri Bezmenov, the KGB defector who described in his 1984 interview how the process of ideological subversion works, identified demoralization as the first and most fundamental stage. Not demoralization in the sense of making people sad. Demoralization in the original sense, the removal of moral framework, the specific erosion of a population's ability to assess reality and respond to it in its own interests. A population that has outsourced its understanding of human relationships to an industrial product engineered for compulsion is a population that has been, in Bezmenov's precise sense, demoralized. Not by a foreign intelligence operation, by market forces that produce the same outcome, because the market forces and the intelligence operation share an interest in a population that is distracted, diminished, and incapable of the genuine human connection that produces the social solidarity on which any meaningful political resistance depends. A man who has built his understanding of intimacy around an industrial product is less capable of genuine relationship. A woman who has built her understanding of her own value around the monetization of her body is less capable of the kind of community and mutual support that allows people to act collectively. A generation that has had its most fundamental interpersonal capacities shaped by platforms designed by algorithms to extract maximum attention and return minimum genuine human value, that generation is easier to manage. It is not a conspiracy. It is an outcome that serves specific interests, and those interests have no incentive to change it. Now, the birth rate. Because the demographic consequence of what is described in this video is not incidental to the rest of it, it is the long-term account of the damage. In 2024, there were 5.7 million more childless women of prime childbearing age in the United States than would have been expected given pre-2008 fertility patterns. Not a small statistical fluctuation, 5.7 million. The University of New Hampshire research calculated that over the past 17 years, the shift in fertility patterns has resulted in 11.8 million fewer births than expected. Among women aged 25 to 29, childlessness rose from 50% in 2014 to 63% in 2024. Among women aged 30 to 34, it rose from 29% to 40%. The fertility rate among women under 30 has hit a record low. 71% of adults in America say having children is not affordable for most people. The primary driver of the birth rate collapse is economic. The housing costs, the wage stagnation, the debt, the cost of childcare, these are real and they explain most of the numbers, but they do not explain all of them. And the cultural signal being sent to young women about what their value consists of, about what the best use of their youth and their bodies is, about what success looks like, that signal is not incidental to the rest of the picture. A culture that presents the monetization of female sexuality as a legitimate and aspirational career path is communicating something specific to young women about themselves. It is communicating that the primary form of value a young woman has access to is sexual, that the most efficient conversion of that value into money flows through a platform that takes 20% and owns the data forever, that Sophie Rain is the aspirational reference point, not the doctor, not the engineer, not the woman who built something that lasts, the woman who made $95 million from a video that never existed. The women of prime childbearing age who are now childless are not all making that choice freely in the full sense. Some of them cannot afford to have children, some of them have not found the right partner, because the men around them have been shaped by a pornography consumption pattern that has altered their capacity for genuine relationship. Some of them have absorbed a specific message about what their 20s are for, and what their value is that makes motherhood feel like a step backward rather than a step forward. These conditions were not created by accident, they were created by an economic system and a cultural apparatus that benefit from the specific conditions they produce. The demographic cliff is what happens at the end of this road. A population that does not reproduce itself does not survive in its current form. Every civilization that has preceded ours that stopped producing children at replacement rate underwent transformation, sometimes gradual, sometimes rapid, that its original inhabitants would not have recognized as continuous with what they had been. The Romans knew this. The fall of the Roman birth rate in the later imperial period was one of the signals the historians of the era identified as marking the beginning of the end. Tacitus noted the decline. Augustus passed legislation trying to reverse it and largely failed. The civilization that had dominated the known world for centuries was replaced not primarily by military defeat, but by demographic exhaustion. The same pattern is visible in the data on American fertility in 2026 if you are willing to look at it. Now, the specific women who are not Sophie Rain. Because the industrial success story and the cultural aspiration are not the experience of the vast majority of the women in this system. The 10,000 who subsidize Sophie Rain, the women uploading content that most of them will not discuss openly with their families, that will exist on servers they do not control for periods of time, they cannot determine. That is owned by a company that takes 20% of everything they make. Many of them made a rational economic calculation in an economy that had closed off other options. The housing costs are real, the wages are real. The specific economic desperation that makes a 19-year-old look at her serving job and look at her phone and make a calculation, that is real. The system that presented them with that calculation, that structured the choices available to them in that specific way, is not interested in their well-being. It is interested in their content. The women who joined at 18 and are now 25 and want to leave and find that the content they produced follows them. The women whose parents were fired from their jobs because of what appeared on the internet. The women who are supporting their families on the income from a platform that will exist long after they want it to stop existing. The women whose relationships with men have been shaped by the specific dynamic of the OnlyFans economy, where male attention is a commodity to be managed and monetized rather than a form of genuine human connection. These are not exceptional cases. These are the normal outcomes of participation in a system that was designed to extract value and was never designed to consider the human cost of that extraction. Mia Khalifa walked away from Bang Bros with $12,000. The company made millions. Pornhub made millions. The system that produced that outcome did not reform itself when people pointed out how unfair it was. It just moved to a different model, where the individual woman appears to have more control and make more money, while the owner of the platform still takes $472 million a year in dividends. The exploitation became more sophisticated, it did not become less. Now the civilizational argument, because all of the above, the platform economics, the Radvinsky-APAC connection, the Weimar parallel, the neuroscience, the birth rate data, adds up to something that deserves to be stated as plainly as the evidence supports. A society that has allowed the sexual commodification of its young women to become a normalized and algorithmically amplified feature of its culture has made a specific civilizational choice, not a conscious choice with a meeting and a vote, a choice by default, through the absence of the honest public deliberation that might have produced a different outcome. The platforms grew, the money flowed, the content proliferated, the age of first exposure fell, the birth rate dropped, the men got worse at relationships, the women got more economically vulnerable even as the language around them became more empowering, and the man who owns the largest platform for all of this took his annual dividend and gave $11 million to the most powerful lobbying organization in American politics. Every great civilization that preceded ours that went through a similar transition, Rome in its decline, Weimar Germany, produced a historical record that was legible in retrospect to everyone who studied it. The specific pattern of the late stage, the bread and circuses, the sexual economy normalized and expanded, the birth rate falling, the young men distracted and diminished, the political class purchased by the same interests that benefit from all of the above. The pattern is not subtle, it is in the data, it is in the Instagram bios, it is in the erectile dysfunction statistics for men under 40, it is in the 11.8 million fewer births than expected. The question is not whether the pattern is there, it is. The question is whether enough people can see it clearly enough and speak about it honestly enough that it produces something different from what it has always produced before. The girls from my year who have OnlyFans links in their bios are not the problem. They are the symptom of a problem that is economic and cultural and civilizational all at once. The economic conditions that made the calculation rational for them were created by specific policy choices made by specific people over specific decades. The cultural conditions that made the choice feel normal, that removed the stigma, that built the aspirational narrative around Sophie Rain, were created by an industry and a media ecosystem that benefit from that normalization. The men consuming the content at 11 years old are not the problem. They are the consequence of a system that has no financial incentive to protect them and every financial incentive to hook them as early as possible. The man with $472 million in annual dividends is not the whole problem. He is the most visible representative of a structure that would find another Radvinsky if he disappeared tomorrow. The structure is what matters, and the structure is a market that has found the most efficient method ever invented for extracting value from human sexuality, deploying it at unprecedented scale through devices in every pocket, normalizing it through the specific mechanism of the aspiration economy. Look at Sophie Rain, you could be her. And directing the proceeds through the hands of increasingly wealthy men and into the political architecture that ensures the conditions for all of the above remain in place. Weimar lasted 14 years before the contradictions it had accumulated became impossible to manage. That is not a prediction. It is a data point from the historical record of what happens when a society undergoes rapid cultural transformation without honest public deliberation about what is happening and who benefits. The honest public deliberation is overdue. This video is part of it, not the most important part, but the conversations that happen in the comment section in the homes of people who watched it, in the minds of young men and young women who recognize something they had not had words for, those conversations are how the deliberation actually happens. Not in parliaments, not in newspaper editorials, in the places where people who are actually living inside the conditions are finally given a framework for understanding what those conditions are and where they come from, and who benefits from them continuing. Look at what is in your phone. Look at what it is doing to you. And then ask who built it, who owns it, and where the money goes. The answer to those questions is not comfortable, but the discomfort of the answer is considerably less than the cost of not asking. Let me go back to Rome. Because the Roman parallel is more precise than most people realize and deserves its own examination, rather than a passing reference. The Roman satirist Juvenal wrote in the 1st century among the people who once bestowed commands, consulships, legions, and all else, now meddle no more and long eagerly for just 2 things, bread and circuses. He was describing the specific mechanism by which the political class of the late Republic and early Empire managed a population that might otherwise have turned its attention to the corruption, the inequality, the gap between the promises of the Republic and the reality of what had replaced it. Give them enough food to survive and enough spectacle to keep them occupied, and they will not ask the questions that would be dangerous to answer. The sexual economy was part of the Roman spectacle. The brothels of Pompeii were not incidental to Roman social life. They were integrated into it, regulated, taxed. The Lupanari in Pompeii had explicit frescoes above each room depicting the acts available within. The Roman state did not attempt to suppress the commercialization of sex. It extracted revenue from it and used it as one component of the management of the population. The same population that was not asking where the Republic had gone. The same population that had stopped producing children at the rate required to maintain the military capacity on which the empire's survival depended. The connection between the expansion of the sexual economy, the decline of the birth rate, and the political passivity of the population is documented by the Roman historians themselves. Tacitus wrote about the decline of Roman virtue. Augustus, terrified by the demographic data of his era, passed the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, legislation imposing penalties on the unmarried and childless, and incentives for those who produced children. It largely failed. The demographic trajectory continued. The empire that had conquered the known world was replaced slowly and then rapidly by something its founders would not have recognized. The bread and circuses of 2026 are more sophisticated than the Colosseum. The circuses are in every pocket. They are personalized by algorithm to maximize the time each individual spends inside them. The sexual economy is not confined to a regulated district of the city. It is accessible to anyone with an internet connection and a credit card, and to anyone under 18 with access to a parent's device, or a friend's phone, or any of the 1,000 routes around the age verification systems that exist in theory and not in practice. The scale is incomparably larger than anything Juvenal or Tacitus could have described. The mechanism is identical. A population scrolling OnlyFans and gaming and consuming algorithmically personalized entertainment for 8 hours a day is a population that is not organizing, not building, not reproducing, not asking the questions that would be dangerous for the people who benefit from the scrolling to answer. The distraction is not incidental to the system, it is a feature of the system, not because someone sat in a room and planned it. Because the market incentives of the attention economy produce distraction as a natural output of optimizing for engagement, and the political class that might have regulated those incentives is the same political class that receives donations from the people who profit from the engagement. The Lupanara at Pompeii was buried under volcanic ash in 79 AD. The city it was part of is now a tourist attraction. The empire it served declined for another 4 centuries before the final collapse. The decline was so gradual that people living inside it could not see it clearly. The specific quality of Roman life that had made it extraordinary, the civic virtue, the martial capacity, the sense of shared purpose and shared fate, drained away slowly, and was not missed until it was gone. Now apply the Shoshana-Zuboff framework, because the economic architecture of what is happening in 2026 is more sophisticated than the Roman version in one critical respect that Zuboff identified and named in her 2019 book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Zuboff's argument is that the major technology platforms, Google, Facebook, and by extension every platform that operates on advertising or subscription models, including OnlyFans, do not primarily produce their stated product, they produce behavioral data. The stated product is the service, the search results, the social network, the content platform. The actual product is the data generated by every interaction with that service, what you searched for, how long you looked at each image, what made you scroll past and what made you stop, what generated an arousal response and what generated boredom, what made you subscribe and what made you cancel. This data is more valuable than the subscription fee. It tells the platform not just what you did, but what you are susceptible to, what your psychological vulnerabilities are, what can be used to predict and modify your future behavior. OnlyFans retaining data permanently is not a footnote. It is the core of the business model. Every interaction between a subscriber and a creator, every message, every purchase, every request, builds a behavioral profile of that subscriber that is owned entirely by Radvinsky's company. The subscribers are not the customers. They are the product, the data they generate by revealing their sexual preferences, their susceptibilities, their loneliness, their willingness to spend money in pursuit of intimacy they are not receiving in their actual lives. That data is the asset. It is owned permanently. what it is used for, who it is sold to or shared with, what the political and commercial applications of a database containing the detailed sexual profiles of millions of men might be, these are questions that have no public answers. The surveillance capitalism framework makes something visible that the simple exploitation framework misses. This is not just an old story about men exploiting women for profit, it is a new story about a platform using the sexual and emotional vulnerabilities of both its creators and its subscribers to generate behavioral data of extraordinary intimacy and value at a scale never before possible, owned permanently by a single billionaire who used the proceeds to fund American political campaigns. The intimacy of the data is what is new. Surveillance capitalism has been applied to shopping behavior and search queries and social media engagement. What OnlyFans generates is surveillance data on human sexuality and emotional need at a level of detail that no previous institution in history has had access to, and it is owned by one man, who denied donating to anything, and whose wife's wire transfer to AIPAC is documented. Now the women who are lost, because you mentioned this and it deserves its own section rather than a passing reference. There is a specific kind of lostness that is visible in the data and in the lives of young women in 2026 that does not reduce to any single cause but has a specific shape. The 63% of American women aged 25 to 29 who are childless, most of them did not decide not to have children. They are living in conditions where having children is not currently possible and may never become possible. They are in an economy that requires two incomes to maintain what one income provided a generation ago. They are in a housing market that may never be accessible to them. They are in relationships with men whose capacity for genuine commitment has been shaped by an attention economy that has rewired their dopamine response and by a pornography consumption pattern that has altered their expectations of women and intimacy. The conditions for the life they were told was available to them, the house, the family, the stability, have been removed. And the cultural apparatus that might have given them an honest account of what was happening and why has instead given them the language of empowerment and the aspiration of Sophie Rain. The specific lostness is the gap between the promise and the reality, between the language of liberation and the function of liberation as a mechanism for extracting value, between the idea that OnlyFans represents freedom and the reality that it represents a slightly more sophisticated version of the same extraction that left Mia Khalifa with $12,000, while the infrastructure made millions. The women are not stupid, they can see the gap. But the culture has provided no honest framework for understanding why the gap exists and who benefits from its existence. The lostness is partly the absence of that framework. The institutional structures that once provided young women with a framework for understanding themselves and their place in the world, family, community, religion, shared cultural narrative, have been weakened or destroyed by the same forces that produce the attention economy and the OnlyFans economy. The church attendance data for young women follows the same trajectory as the birth rate data. The participation in civic organizations follows the same trajectory. The social isolation data follows the same trajectory. These are not independent phenomena. They are expressions of the same underlying process of atomization, the deliberate or inadvertent destruction of the collective structures that allowed people to understand themselves in relation to something larger than their individual economic situation. A young woman who has no community, no shared narrative, no institutional framework for understanding her own value, and who is operating in an economy that has made the traditional paths to security inaccessible, that young woman is maximally susceptible to the specific message that OnlyFans delivers. That her value is sexual, that monetizing that value is empowerment, that Sophie Rain is the aspiration. The platform did not create her vulnerability. The broader system created her vulnerability. The platform is simply the most efficient mechanism yet invented for extracting value from it. The question worth asking, and it is the question that this video cannot fully answer but that the comments will, is what replaces the destroyed structures, not the return of the old ones, not nostalgia. What actually functions as community and shared narrative and framework for understanding in 2026 for a young woman who is living inside the conditions described in this video? The answer has to be something real. Something that is not just another product. Something that does not extract 20% of everything she produces and retain the data forever. The honest answer is that this is the hardest question in the video, and it does not have a clean answer. What it has is the beginning of a conversation that requires honesty about what the conditions are and who created them, and what interests are served by their continuation. A conversation that the mainstream media, the political class, and the platforms themselves have every incentive to prevent from happening. This video is the beginning of that conversation, not the end. Look at what is in your phone, look at what it is doing to you, and then ask who built it, who owns it, and where the money goes. The answer to those questions is not comfortable, but the discomfort of the answer is considerably less than the cost of not asking. There is one more thing to say, and it is the thing that is hardest to say without being misread. So let me be precise about it. This video is not an attack on the women who are on OnlyFans. It is not a moral judgment on their choices. The choices make rational sense in the conditions that exist. The conditions are the problem. The people who created the conditions are the problem. The platform that profits from the conditions while presenting itself as the solution to the conditions is the problem. And this video is not an attack on male sexuality or an argument that men should be ashamed of what they find arousing. The neuroscience of what pornography consumption does to the developing brain is not a moral argument, it is a description of a physical process. The 11-year-old who is first exposed to an industrial product engineered for compulsion is not making a moral failure. He is being subjected to something designed by people who understand exactly what it does and have deployed it deliberately because it generates revenue. The targets of this video, and if targets is the right word, are the structures, the platform economics, the ownership, the data retention, the APAC donation, the streaming influencers who use the platform's creators as content to reach young audiences, the mainstream media that has decided these women are interesting enough to interview and platform without ever asking the structural questions about who benefits from the system that produced them, the political class that has taken money from the owner of the platform and declined to regulate it in ways that might protect the people inside it, the broader economic system that created the conditions of vulnerability that the platform exploits. These are not abstract forces, they are specific decisions made by specific people. The decision to not implement effective age verification, the decision to retain user data permanently, the decision to take 20% of creator revenue rather than a smaller percentage, the decision to expand the platform's market to new audiences including underage ones through the streaming ecosystem, the decision to donate $11 million to AIPAC, the decision to deny the donation. Each of these decisions was made by someone, each of them serves specific interests, and each of them has specific consequences for the people, the women who produce the content and the men who consume it, who have no voice in those decisions. The lesson is that rapid cultural transformation without honest public deliberation produces conditions in which the people with the most to lose have the least say in what happens to them. The honest public deliberation is the thing that was absent in Weimar. It is the thing that is absent now, and the absence serves specific interests. The specific interest it serves most directly is the interest of the man taking $472 million a year in dividends from a platform built on the sexual labour of young women, while donating the proceeds to the organisation that has spent more money shaping American congressional elections than any single issue group in the country's history. That sentence is documentable. Every claim in it has a source. None of it requires conspiracy theory, all of it requires paying attention to what is actually happening and being willing to say so. This video has tried to do that. What comes next is up to the conversation it starts.